Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers. I'm talking about this book. You probably can't see it here. It's a fairly thin black volume from Thomson, Sweet Maxwell, and it's called Offshore Business Centres, A World Survey. It's published by, as I say, Sweet Maxwell, and written by Milton Grundy and Grundy Nathan. What I've done, I've had a good look at this book because it's an interesting one, looking at the global markets that we have at the moment. I've given it the title, Grundy and Nathan Place Tax Centres in the Palm of Your Global Hand, because what we're talking about here is we're looking at the various centres around the world where you can get fairly good tax organisations for your particular business. What we've got here with Grundy and Nathan is them painting an extensive and detailed picture of international tax planning, which is how they sort of term it, with the 8th edition of this Offshore Business Centres publication, obviously subtitled A World Survey because it's looking at the global market. They consider each of the jurisdictions in part 1 of the book, setting out a discussion of the various financial services available in each of the locations listed, and there are a substantial number of locations, of course. There's also useful legislative coverage of the workings of each of these offshore jurisdictions and how each of the locations functions in relation to different vehicles and structures. It then goes on to part 2, which tends to be actually a shorter section, devoted to 4 relevant talks given by the ITPA covering the OECD and the offshore world, tax information exchange agreements, holding companies in Europe, an overview, and the Smith story. And obviously gives various advisory panels in the locations at the back. Much, of course, has happened to the offshore world as we know it, and we have no idea what the future is going to hold with the current economic downturn. But it is described here as the long and sometimes acrimonious battle between the pros and the antis of offshore activity, and of course the press does tend to cover this fairly heavily. The main change that we have with this book is the evaluation of the amount of regulatory activity which is now taking place in a globalized financial market. Obviously that's something that's highly relevant in the early part of 2009. This book, of course, was written some 6 months or so ago. What we're looking at is the issue of course, zero tax or low tax jurisdictions as location for hedge funds and other activities. I'm sure this is going to become probably of more significance in the next few years as the world depression starts to change the pattern and the way we do things. As I've said, it's a relatively small book at 300 pages, but it's got quite a lot of heavy detail in it and unrivaled expertise, of course, throughout. It offers a complete study of relevant tax regimes. It outlines the legislative systems in actually 51 offshore centres, giving comparisons of the advantages of each and showing how they differ from one another, so you can choose the one that suits you. And it refers to recent legislation, tax treaties and information exchange agreements, which of course are directly relevant. Now, I'm sure that experienced practitioners have written each jurisdiction chapter very much from their own perspective and from within that jurisdiction itself, so they've made sure that all the published details are completely accurate. Obviously there are a number of additional jurisdictions which have come in, that's Dubai, Australia and the US, for this 8th edition. I think I can say that what Grundy and Nathan have done here is they give us as the practitioners an understanding of the complex intricacies of the different offshore jurisdictions covered within the book. It's an important aid, in my view, to international tax planning, because it states that in each location the local treatment of income and CGT and the use of tax treaties is fully explored, and therefore be extremely helpful for people depending on where their businesses take them. With the rich and the very rich growing in numbers at the moment, notwithstanding what we've seen with the downturn economically, the offshore industry certainly appears to be flourishing, although, as both Grundy and Nathan say, anything resembling a statistic is rare indeed in this particular area. There are updates which they've included to any changes which take place in legislation in the territories covered since the previous 7th edition came out, and obviously there are new tax treaties and agreements which are highlighted. The book says in its introduction that it's for information purposes and doesn't constitute legal advice, and that's really what this book is about. You shouldn't take it as the authoritative legal guide, but it is an advice book. But to my mind it's indispensable and deals with complex financial advice in a nice handbook form, which succeeds with the purpose it set itself of putting detailed information on offshore business centres in a wider context of the individual countries' tax systems, and I think they're spot on here, so it's well worth reading. Thank you very much. Goodbye.